Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem. Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem.
Well, hello there, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophy Film Club. And today's show is going to be on Monty Python's The Holy Grail, perhaps one of the funniest films I've ever seen in my lifetime. I remember it from my teens very fondly, and some of the greatest quotes that are forever memorable. And one of the great films of Monty Python. I mean, certainly on a par with Life of Brian. And of course, today I've got Adi with me, my co-host. And hey, Adi, what did you think? And how was your? You have a little bit of an introduction for us, so I'm going to let you go into that if you can.
Yeah, it's hi Pat. It's quite funny that you found this movie so amusing and so hilarious that the only comparison that you could have made was with another movie by Monty Python, which is The Life of Brian. And I think this movie is one of the most hilarious movies of all time, and comparable only to other creations of the Monty Python crew. So quite an unusual pick for the Philosophy Film Club, don't you think?
It was, yeah. I ummed and ahed about it, but yeah, I think it was a good idea, Adi. It was a good idea.
Yeah, I've heard that from many of my friends and also from a couple of our listeners, but I'm totally ready to prove them wrong.
Yeah.
So I think this movie actually belongs in the Philosophy Film Club more than many others that we've done in the past. So. About the Holy Grail a little bit. Monty Python and the Holy Grail is what is commonly called a book show. Now, this is a specific format where the story has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. But, the passage between the scenes is done just by flipping the pages of a book. And, although the book shows have some sort of an ending, they generally don't always have a clear conclusion. Just like in the case of the Holy Grail, we don't really have a conclusion of the movie. It's just some sort of a suspended ending.
You could call it that.
Yeah. This movie was shot on a very, very low budget, and they chose this format the format of the book show, in order to save money. Just a little piece of trivia that will help our listeners understand how scrappy and ingenious the crew had to be in producing this movie. Terry Gilliam's wife, she was the one that turned the pages, and the book scenes were actually shot in their living room.
Right.
So anyway, although the Holy Grail, at first glance seems to be a comedy without much meaning behind it, the Monty Python crew, in their classic style, reducing to the absurd every single scene, are actually delivering many meaningful messages. And the movie is actually a collection of logical fallacies, which are interspaced with absurd interactions between the characters and even between two different time periods. So speaking about these logical fallacies, every scene seems to be a parody of a different logical fallacy. And I'm going to talk about a few of them here, but I'm sure that our listeners that want to take time and watch the movie again, they will be able to find many, many, many more.
Yeah.
So the logical fallacies are almost never ending. The easiest fallacy to spot in a debate as well as in the movie is the ad hominem. So in the movie, we have the French taunting scene. And this is nothing but a series of ad hominems delivered, as ad hominems are usually delivered, in a tirade of nonsensical insults. We have the argument from authority, or appeal to authority. That is the anarcho-syndicalist scene, which is nothing more but a hilarious representation of this logical fallacy. He goes, "I am Arthur, King of the Britain." The lady of the lake, her arm clad in shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. And the peasants' dismissal of this argument from authority, clear argument from authority, is equally hilarious. He
Right.
goes, listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. You can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you.
It was the aquatic bints, I think. Was the best line.
Yeah. It's the way they go in the representation of these logical fallacies, just so hilarious. And once you set on a quest of discovering each logical fallacy, the movie becomes a lot more interesting and a lot more enjoyable, I would say.
Yeah.
Then we have the non sequitur. Now this is probably the most easy fallacy to spot in the movie after the ad hominem, and is the perversion of the Socratic method in the witch scene. And that the way they use the Socratic method leads to a form of non sequitur, and more specifically, the fallacy of undistributed middle, which is pretty much a series of disconnected correlations that leads to a fallacious conclusion. So in the Holy Grail, this fallacy sounds something like, what do you do with witches? We burn them. And what do you burn apart from witches? Wood. So why do witches burn? Because they're made of wood. So how do we tell if she is made of wood? Does wood sink in water? Oh, no, it floats. What also floats on water? A duck. So logically, emphasis on logically, if she weighs the same as a duck, then she's made of wood and therefore a witch. I actually had debates where my opponent's reasoning sounded very similar to the kind of fallacious argumentation depicted in this scene. Yeah, and also, this scene portrays the two different methods of argumentation. It begins as an argument from proof and ends up as an argument from reason, or in this case, better said, an argument from fallacy.
Yeah.
But you can find these fallacies all throughout the movie, and I didn't really have time to sit down and identify all of them, but it is my strong conviction that pretty much every single dialogue is a fallacy. And
I guess that's the source of their humor, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
It's a fallacy. It's I'd never thought of it like that, but it's so true.
Yeah, and we have the historian fallacy, which is so depicted in this movie in such a hilarious way. Now, this fallacy happens when one assumes that the rulers of the past viewed the events from the same perspective as they do, and we actually get to witness the decapitation of this fallacy in the scene where the famous historian talks about the adventures of the knights as if they were a glorious story of bravery and strategy, until that knight just rides in and chops his head off.
Or slits his throat or something. Yeah, he does chop his head off, doesn't he? I think. Yeah.
Well, I don't think it was off, but he really cuts his throat, like
pretty much, yeah.
And the red herring and moving the goalposts. Now, the knights who say "ni" represent that scene is actually the representation of two different logical fallacies. It's a combination of the red herring fallacy and moving the goalposts. So the red herring, which is pretty much a deviation from the original argument, intended to mislead or to distract the opponent from its original train of thought. It's quite easy to spot if you look for it. Arthur's quest, after meeting the knights who say "ni," turns from a quest for the Holy Grail into a quest for shrubbery. And also, when Arthur returns with the shrubbery, the knights who say "ni" demand that the mightiest tree in the forest be cut with a herring. And to me, this is the equivalent of how the greatest argument can be destroyed by simply misleading your opponent, making use of the red herring fallacy.
Right.
So
they literally used a herring as well.
Yeah. That's
Very
a
good.
clear indication.
Yeah.
And now the moving the goalposts is also pretty clear in this scene. Moving the goalpost is a fallacy in which a well-proven argument is dismissed, and then another and much greater proof is usually demanded. So when Arthur delivers finally the shrubbery, the knights that until recently said "knee" demand another shrubbery.
Right.
They just move the goalposts. So and they say then, when Arthur finds the shrubbery, he must place it there besides the first shrubbery, only slightly higher, so we will get two-level effect with a little path down the middle. So it's demanding more and more proof and better and better reasoning, and in a debate. This is pretty much the moving the goalpost. So this is an absurd and again hilarious example of these two logical fallacies. It's probably the best depiction of these fallacies that I've ever seen, since in debates the opponents that move the goalposts at times sound exactly like the knights who say "knee."
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I was listening to somebody's take on Monty Python from an economic perspective. It was quite interesting, and they were talking about the economics of incentives, so the choices that we have when we make economic decisions, when we're making economic decisions. And of course, it highlighted some of the absurd economic decisions that were taken in Monty Python, around the Holy Grail. And of course, the famous one being the Black Knight, of course, who, after losing an arm, decided it was just a flesh wound. And
I've heard the worst.
I mean, in economic terms, he should have just pulled out and bowed out, by then. But he ended up becoming decapitated completely and losing all of his limbs.
That's funny that you bring the economic aspect up. I actually stumbled upon a piece of trivia, of course, researching for this podcast. And did you know that Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and Elton John, they both funded the film?
No, I didn't know that. It doesn't surprise me, though, at all.
Yeah. Actually, in 1974, in England, and you should know this a lot better than me, the rich were paying insane taxes, sometimes up to 80 or 90%.
Yeah, I think it was 95%. Yeah.
Yeah. So the music stars and actors who made a lot of money were looking, for ways to circumvent those taxes. So they invested in the Grail. And now the budget was still small because it was a personal investment, and the actors had to mime riding the horse and banging coconuts together. There is also no ad-libbing in the movie, but the movie pulled in a considerable income, since it had such a huge success, but it cost so little to make. Yeah. And the cool thing is that some funds that came from Pink Floyd's album, The Dark Side of the Moon, were actually put towards funding the Grail. And
that's interesting.
As far as I read, the Pink Floyd were huge fans of the show, and they sometimes would stop their recording sessions just to watch Monty Python when they came on TV. So
yeah, I discovered some other trivia about it. It was that apparently one of the producers had decades later decided to he'd convinced the judge somewhere, I think in the US or wherever, I don't know exactly where, but convinced the judge that he was supposed to get some some of the royalties or profits from the Holy Grail, and of course they were pleased with saying, well, I don't remember ever having this discussion with this person. And apparently they got a lawyer who their lawyer was for the band Queen. And so what they actually said, well, he says, because apparently it was like it was difficult to get off it. So they said, well, look, he said to them, why don't you just put on a show? And they put on a show, I think, at the O2 Theatre, which the O2 was their last, I think it was their last show, which they did in, I can't remember what year it was, but that's where they all did it together at the O2 Arena in London. And that was basically to pay off this producer who'd managed to sort of convince a judge that they owed him a lot of money, of course. So yeah, that was quite funny. So obviously they did have their fingers in pop, their fingers in pop stars and all sorts of things. So
yeah. Another piece of trivia that I stumbled upon. Let's get them all out right now in the introduction, and it was pretty funny. It was that the movie, when it opened at Cannes, the film festival, the opening credits, of course, the opening credits are plain and weird because the sequence was done at the end of filming and there was no budget left. So the Swedish subtitles were written by Michael Palin in the hope to entertain the audience. But when the film was introduced at Cannes for the first time, the subtitles did get a lot of laughs, but what happened is that right at the end of the credits, a bunch of firemen ran inside the theater and told everybody to get out. Now, because of the absurdity of this movie and the absurdity of these freaking titles, and the perfect coincidence of events, everyone thought that it was just another prank and that it was all part of the show.
Right.
And however, they had been evacuated for a real bomb threat.
Right.
And everybody was super calm and laughing, and there was no panic. But after they cleared the theater and the bomb threat was proven wrong, everyone went back and continued to watch the movie. So.
Well, so they thought it was a bit of a. They thought Monty Python was playing tricks on them.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's not surprising because I think they did that sort of. That was their famous show in LA. I think I can't remember what it was called now, but they used to play tricks on the audience all the time in that particular stage production. You know.
Yeah, but imagine you're in the theater and these titles show up, and it's Monty Python, and they're pulling pranks on people, and then a bunch of, like, right at the end of the credits, a bunch of firemen just invade the theater. You're like, okay, Monty Python, I'll get out, I get it, it's a prank.
Yeah. Well, was there anything more you wanted to add on that before we take our listeners into our listener call we had the other day? But
well, I wanted to talk a little bit about the crew.
Oh, okay.
And just to paint for our listeners a little picture of who are the creators of this movie and why is this movie, and why did this movie turn out the way it did. And Monty Python has a kind of left brain versus right brain combination, in their creations. And this apparently is due to the fact that the group appears to be split right down the middle. Now, John Cleese and Eric Idle and Graham Chapman went to Cambridge, while Michael Palin and Terry Jones went to Oxford. And of course, Terry Gilliam was the group's only American and fell somewhere in the middle. So according to
Footlights Theatre or something they were part of.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not really
the one in Cambridge,
informed on that. So, but anyway, according to Gilliam's observations, the middle ground of the group, the Cambridge team's MO was a strong offense. More logical and more precise, combined with obvious verbal skills. While on the other side, the Oxford team were more conceptual, more artistic. And it is said that whenever Python had a disagreement, there was always a split down the middle of these groups.
Right.
So I just thought that this was a piece of information that one should have before watching the creations of this peculiar group.
So it was John Cleese and who else? Who went to Cambridge?
John Cleese, Eric Idle, and Graham Chapman. Yeah.
And it was Terry Jones
and Michael Palin, the Oxford Yeah, the Oxford group.
It's interesting because I saw an interview today with John Cleese and Terry Jones, and Terry Jones just really didn't have much verbal. He didn't seem to be, I'm faced with John Cleese, of course. John Cleese was like throwing out joke after joke, constantly.
Yeah.
And Terry Jones was kind of just sat there, kind of slightly morbidly unimpressed. It was kind of funny. So that kind of makes sense when you say if they were like, one was more analytical and the other more verbally.
Yeah, I think they have an array of different talent from the one extreme to the other.
Although Palin
Gilliam right in the middle.
Palin is really verbally acute. I must just having known him with his more recent shows with the Pole to Pole series that he did and stuff. He's actually much more verbally acute than say someone like Terry Jones.
Mm-hmm.
Terry Jones does have some really hilarious moments in a Python stuff, so I don't want to be too hard on him.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful for those because those are the ones that really really make me laugh. So yeah, let's get to the callers hangout.
Yeah, well, we had a call with a couple of guys that came from our to our hangout, and we're going to really just go straight into that now. It was Jeff Bolan and Justin who joined us, both from the US, and they had quite a bit to say, and it was we had quite a fun conversation. So I'm gonna take it on to that, and we'll come back to you afterwards. One of the things, just overall, generally, and this is something that Monty Python does an awful lot, and it's really interesting, I find, because it's sort of a point in time. I mean, this film was done, I think, the mid to late 70s, I think, and it so much of the comedy is a reminder about being in school, At least for me. I mean, I went to a private school, and I went to we call them public schools here, weirdly, but they're basically a private school, and it's very much this sort of the way that God spoke to him was like the headmaster or something, the way that when the witch was being tried, it was this logical, illogical steps they were going through, of course, at the time, but it was just so much like school. It's the way that they used to patronize you at school, and this attempt to make you think. And it was funny because in many ways the whole thing is completely illogical. The whole movie is bonkers, really. I mean, it's completely bonkers in many ways. There's nothing. Most of it, in fairness, whilst it's bonkers, it's a kind of a swipe at culture, I think. Generally a swipe at culture. It just takes the piss out of culture from going back in history right up until the future, when you had like the business with the anarcho-syndicalists, having their sort of talk about how they arrange things now, and it's a swipe at all of it, interestingly, and I think that makes really interesting social commentary, I thought, in so many ways,
Yeah, like we're an anarcho-syndicalist commune. Because I have the quote right here. We take turns to act as a sort of executive officer of the week, but all the decisions of that officer have to be ratified by a special bi-weekly meeting, by a simple majority in the case of purely internal affairs, and by a 2/3 majority in the case of more. And there's where Arthur interrupts him, and that scene is surreal. Is probably
like it was any better than the monarchy, right?
Yeah.
They're all equal, and they're digging in the mud and beating at water, and I couldn't figure out what the first people they ride by when they're on their way to that castle. They seem to be digging at the grass. And I couldn't figure out what they were trying to do.
I didn't even notice the menial tasks they were doing until I just saw it this week, because I haven't seen it in almost, since I was like a teenager, and so I'm like, wow, they're all just doing nothing but digging in the dirt and stacking mud.
Exactly. Justin, I don't know if you noticed, but in the background, more than once, at least 3 times that I know of, people seem to be banging cats against various objects. Like,
I don't understand that at all.
one woman is banging this cat against the wall. In another scene, there's that person... one person banging a cat against a tree, and if I'm not mistaken, in a scene one is banging the cat against the river. There's like a pond of water there, and he's just throwing the cat in the water.
Yeah.
Is that like a British thing, Patrick? Do the British hate cats, or is that a Monty Python thing?
So yeah, I mean, I have no idea. I watched it again today, and I had the same thought. Where the hell did that come from? It does seem it's part of this bonkers. I say, but that's a very English word I'm using. It's just part of this absurdity, I think, of the whole thing, you know. And I think they just add these extra left field things into it. And it's not just that. I mean, that was. I mean, that whole thing with the French, right, attacking them with livestock, you know, is hilarious because it's a kind of it's a basically that is basically a kind of ironic sort of statement about the French and their subsidies, and back in the 70s when they were like, you know, they had they would subsidise their farmers. I think they still do now, to the nth degree. Just at a time where we were sort of kind of getting rid of most of the subsidies, although we still have them, but they're not to the same degree as the French. And so that was a bit of a joke at the French, I suppose. But the cat thing, I don't get it at all.
Well, before we go back to the cat thing, let me talk a little bit about the war scene where they throw cows and ducks and chicken and bags of food, practically. They're throwing their supplies out to destroy the enemy. I think that was a portrayal of the waste that war usually is,
I hadn't even
and
thought
the
of it that way.
destruction of resources involved in any war. Because on one side, okay, you got the people in the castle who, in order to attack their enemy, they throw away all their supplies. Then on the other side, you have the attackers who go out in the forest and spend enormous amount of time and resources building this bunny, this Trojan bunny.
Trojan rabbit, yeah.
Which, of course, it's their secret weapon. The secret weapon it goes wrong, and the adversaries capture it, and then they use it to attack their enemy. Isn't this like the way war goes all the time? I mean, especially lately with America arming, the United States arming their enemies and then having their weapons used against them, and plus the whole portrayal of destruction of resources in a war.
Yeah. In a broader psychological / philosophical context, I didn't know this about the Pythons until just recently when I don't know if you guys saw that that book I found on Google, but I always wondered why they were so big on the heavy word usage, like the big words, complex arguments, but spewing them out in ridiculous contexts and really fast. And a lot of the writers for the Pythons were big on analytical philosophy, and when you the scenes that Addie just mentioned are very true with the war analogy, but you could also see it as that's how a lot of people, to an analytical philosopher, I'm sure that's how a lot of people seem to argue. They just throw shit at one another and just waste time. Because the French were just, making gestures and whatnot, and they weren't having an argument, whereas relative to the first scene with the swallows and the specific species of swallows and how much weight they could carry and all that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I think it was very much a socio-political thing at the time, I think, between the French and the English, and they were kind of they were making a bit of a joke about that, I think. But it does lend itself to the context that Adi was talking about, of course, because subsidies is a waste, of course, and there was a kind of war between the French and the English, but it wasn't really a war. It wasn't a war as such, of course, but it was more of a war of words, I suppose. Hence the tactic of, what was it? They called it taunting, you know, and you know, but it was between the French and the English about how, you know, that they were getting lots of subsidies from the EU, or the EEC as it was known back then, you know, and the English weren't, you know, and so I think that's the context, I think, of that particular type of joke, but it you know, it lends itself to what you're saying, Adi, totally.
Yeah. Well, regarding that, I think very few people know that Monty Python's Holy Grail is actually a parody of another movie that was released in the same year and describes the adventures of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Now, the name of that movie is Lancelot of the Lake, and it is a French production. It's a French production which strips the British legend of King Arthur and, of course, of his knights. It strips them of their bravery and holiness and depicts them as losers and as conniving and greedy people. So Lancelot of the Lake, which is...
I never realised that. Sorry.
Yeah, it's not a comedy, Lancelot of the Lake, the French production, and it ends in mass slaughter, where Arthur and all his knights are killed. So to me, I read about this, and the Holy Grail seems to be the British response to this French attack against one of the most cherished cultural icons in British history. Plus, you know, the British and French rivalry is historically well known. Yeah. So I think the Monty Python crew seems to say, if anyone wants to trash our culture, it should be us, for we can do it best, you know. But
I watched that. That's interesting. Yeah.
I watched bits and pieces of course I couldn't watch it all because it was in French and I didn't even find the movie with subtitles, but I watched bits and pieces of Lancelot of the Lake, and the similarities between the two movies are uncanny. I mean, the landscapes seem to be almost identical in places. Some of the scenes and the themes are just hilarious replicas of the other movie, the French production. Right. And the two French tauntings in the Holy Grail, they seem to me at least, to clearly point out the connection between the two movies.
Yeah, because I was going to say, because I couldn't think of, there wasn't French. I was trying, because normally what Monty Python does is they take an historical reference and they make a joke about it, but it's nothing historical. I was trying to think today, actually, there's nothing historical about the French being in England. The only thing that's historical about French is that the aristocracy spoke the French language, but I don't even know if they spoke that king around that sort of period of history. But I know they did at some point. The aristocracy spoke French in this country, in the UK. I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so that makes sense that they're actually they're taking the piss out of this film. So yeah, good stuff. Good find.
That was a good find. How'd you even find that?
It was referenced in an article in the New York Times from 1974, who came out on the day when the movie, when the Holy Grail was released. So the article mentioned the fact that this is just a parody to the other movie.
I do remember a King Arthur film coming out in the 70s, just I think. But I don't know if it was that one. It may have been. I never actually got to see it, if I remember. But yeah. They
both came out in 74. The other one was a bigger production, and I guess the Monty Python crew managed to do, as far as the cinematography went, just as a good job as the French did it, with almost no budget at all.
I was going to say, it was cheap budget, wasn't it? Compared to Life of Brian, this was done on a shoestring, literally.
Yeah.
I mean, even the quality of the film is. I mean, I think it must have been done on 16mm film, at the time, which perhaps even low, high grade videotape back then, I guess. But yeah, it was.
I think it survived kind of well. Either that, or it was restored well, because it looked fine in every stream I was able to find it on.
Yeah. I mean, it was watchable. But it was just the quality was compared to say Life of Brian or something like that was definitely noticeable. You know, it was less quality, but yeah. But that was part of the charm of the film, I think.
I think that was part of the charm of the film. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think it's almost like it was intended to be some, almost like a B movie, a B- movie, with more intelligent concepts buried in it than you would give it credit for. And I think that's why a lot of people they see it for the absurdity and the repetitiveness that it is, but they don't, especially if you were not old enough or even had come forth from your mama's knickers at that point in time. You wouldn't have known what the context was. I mean, I had no idea what was going on back in the 70s. I wasn't even alive.
No, sure.
Yeah, it's funny how the parody has survived and lasted much better than what was thought then to be a work of art from the French,
Yeah, the French, yeah.
I mean, that was my general impression of the movie when you guys first brought it up as a topic for the show. I'm like, really? The Holy Grail? Because their initial impression is kind of, it's funny, haha, but you don't know what to say about it beyond that it's funny until you do a little more reading about the context of the times and what it may or may not have been in response to. Then the more interesting intellectual stuff comes out, aside from the dialogue, of course.
Well, as I said before, I think this movie is just full of philosophical content, and you have to dig a little bit deeper to find it. Although some of it might be really out in the open. So, on this note, how do you guys feel about approaching the state theme in the Holy Grail? Is it too early?
No,
you can jump right into it.
Because I had a few thoughts about it, and I'm ready to make a case here for you. So, in the Holy Grail, I think Monty Python offers one of the best sarcastic depictions of the state and also of the three branches of government. So hear me out. Throughout their travels, Arthur and his knights are stopped in their journey by, we have the three-headed knight, the Black Knight, and of course the knights who say "me," and yes, I'm gonna say it like that. These annoying, completely irrational and unavoidable interferences are clear portrayals to me of the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch of government. So the three-headed knight is clearly, and Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, a parody of England's three-party system: the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Democrats.
Right. Interesting.
The bickering and the what?
At least they have a three-party system. We're still
two.
So
we got more. It's just nobody takes the rest of them seriously. The Constitution, the Communists, the Green Party,
and the Independents.
The Independents, the Libertarian Party, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
sorry, go ahead.
The three-headed knight and the bickering and the constant disagreement between the three different heads that are attached to the same body is, to me, an obvious ridicule of the inefficiency and the absurdity of the British political system. And this would be the legislative branch. So then we have the Black Knight. Now, the Black Knight is a representation of brute force, the brute force of the state, most commonly known as the executive branch or law enforcers.
Right.
So the Black Knight is placed in front of this bridge over a ditch that, can easily be jumped. And in this scene, Monty Python, I think, chooses to show the futility and irrationality of political rules. The Black Knight, he doesn't know why he is guarding the bridge or why people should be prevented from passing. He only knows that he needs to guard it. He knows no reason.
Right.
He's there to do a job without question, and he will fight until his last drop of blood to enforce it. So that would be the executive branch. And the knights who say "me," they're the judicial system. They are dressed in long black robes, and they scream edicts at the travelers.
Right.
So in the Holy Grail, the words pronounced by these knights seem to have the power to hurt people and to compel them to do things they wouldn't normally do. Also, their demands are completely irrational, and their edicts change very quickly and without warning. You know, from the absurd "me" to the even more absurd, and God help me, I'm going to actually do it. Ekipetang!
You did it!
You
I
did
did
it.
it.
So I think that's what they're trying to portray here. The entire state apparatus, which Monty Python chooses to depict as you know, the cleverly disguised highwaymen who scream edicts, demand offerings, and impede the passage of the traveler by confusion or just by pure force.
Right.
So what do you guys think about this idea of the branches of government and the knights?
I think that's the most concise and compelling argument for a slapstick movie analogy towards the state I have ever heard in my life. Even if I disagreed with you, I probably wouldn't even voice it. I'd be like, that's fine.
I don't have an argument against it.
I just can't understand.
Not humorous enough, anyway.
Yeah. Gosh.
Yeah, the three knights were hilarious, weren't they? Arguing about tea in the end.
Yeah. They reminded me of politicians immediately. I mean, as soon as I saw that bickering, that's what started my research and tried to look to understand who these people represent. Because when I saw the three-headed knight, I'm like, oh, that's politics.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and weren't they looking after the I couldn't. It was a bit weird, but I got the impression they were looking after the autonomous collective. But it was a bit sort of it was after that particular scene where they had the anarcho-syndicalist conversation, but they seemed to be all these people digging in the dirt again, which they were surrounded by, and of course all these signposts to death. Which was, of course, Sir Robin was being roundly humiliated by his bard, which is kind of funny. Yeah.
Courageously ran away.
Yeah, that was so lyrically well done, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Pythons are very lyrically skilled, I think. I mean, I don't know who the writers are there, but I always enjoyed the Pythons' dialogue.
I think they wrote it themselves, between them. It was. I mean, I think they pretty much written all of their stuff, from what I gather, and yeah. But going on the conversation about estate, I mean, going back earlier to what I was saying, I think that there's this other thing where it's just this, like you get with comedy now. I know this was a kind of idea I sort of wanted to thrash out with you guys just to see what you think, because most comedy, like a lot of art forms these days, tends to be quite sort of nihilistic, I find, seems to be sort of hopelessly gloomy, but hopelessly absurd. And one of the things about the Monty Python, whilst it is absurd, it's not hopelessly absurd. It's not I don't find it so absurd that it has no meaning or it has a sort of hopelessness attached to it. It's really just poking fun at culture, at the state, maybe at other institutions, etc. But it does it in a kind of in a way that highlights the irrationality of it, of course, but it doesn't sort of throw us into an abyss of
depression,
hopelessness, which a lot of comedy does. I mean, a lot of comedy has been really highly influenced by by the Monty Python's massively influential on comedy for decades after. You know, a lot of people. I mean, of course, I speak as an older person here. I can think of comedians that you'll probably, even Blackadder and stuff like that, and right up until the present day. You know, in many ways they've been highly influenced, even by a more well-known international comedian. I can't remember his name now off the top of my head. The chap who died in his 30s.
Did he smoke a lot and drink a lot?
Yeah. That's the one. I can't remember his name.
Is that whittle the list down at all?
No.
Probably not.
Oh gosh, I can't remember. His name.
Was that the guy that he would always like scream at the microphone? Not the larger guy, but I know who you mean. Bill Hicks, is that what you're trying to say?
Hicks, that's it. Yes. Yeah. Even Bill Hicks, you know, in some ways. Of course, Hicks was.
Or Sam Kinison.
Sorry.
Sam Kinison was the other guy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Bill Hicks. It was Bill Hicks, kind of nihilistic and stuff like that, and a lot of this subsequent is like subsequent comedy, and I think this sort of reflects a lot in the art forms, in all forms of art forms these days. There's this kind of postmodern sort of a nihilistic kind of approach to everything everything that the world culture, etc., brings, you know, to it. And so yeah, I think they were really quite sort of ahead of their time in many ways, but they were kind of relying on in the history of comedy. There was the Goons, of course, which came before them, which was a British radio show, which was really funny. I think there was an American type version as well, which I can't quite remember the names of those guys. Wish I'd looked them up now. But the Goons, they were very heavily influenced by a British radio show called Goons, which had Spike Milligan. If anybody's particularly familiar with British comedians, Spike was a comedian that died. I think he died about 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah, that's where a lot of the lunacy and the absurdity came from for them. And the postmodern part, which I think is interesting with Python, was the way that they brought reality into this movie, where they had this strange scene with a historian, you know, that gets his throat cut.
Oh, yeah.
And they have the police force arrive, you know, to break him up and say about to invade the castle, you know. And that worked really well. It was kind of absurdly funny, you know, and you know, sort of, but again was a bit of a pop at the modern culture as well.
Well, I think the scene with the British historian, I think it refers to the fact that Arthur is nothing but a legend. Although he's a British cultural icon, it's still a legend, and his historical existence seems to be unproven. But there still seem to be quite a few debates among historians about it. So I think this is like, did Arthur exist? Did he not exist? You know, how even if the only sources of Arthur's existence are found only in folklore and literature. Some historians, at least back in the 70s, were still disputing the authenticity of the story. So I truly enjoyed the famous historian scene where this stuffy professor was talking about, you know, the times in the past were so glorious and so, you know, holy, and then reality just comes on a horse and slashes his throat open.
Yeah.
Because that's what those times were, like, full of force and of disease, and there was nothing to be glorified. So that's what that scene pretty much said to me.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. And before we go on any further, Pat, I like how you brought up Bill Hicks there, and it's interesting because you know, just thought of this now. Bill Hicks used to end his routines by acting out his own assassination. There'd be the sound of gunshots, and then he'd fall down in a heap on stage. because the state was assassinating him for speaking the truth. But then at the end of Monty Python, Arthur and what's his name, Bedivere, they're arrested for killing the historian.
Yeah.
So it goes back into what you said about nihilism versus just lightheartedly poking fun at various institutions for comedy's sake.
Yeah.
Because while we're sad to see Bill get shot for speaking the truth, we celebrate certainly these two murderers getting apprehended and going off to jail.
Right.
Yeah, and they're arrested in what appears to be a classic riot scene, like a street a street riot scene.
I was going to bring up the same point, Jeff, about how the cops. I mean, for me, when they came in at the end, they were kind of a nihilistic downer, and I mean, it was a scene of absurdity in of itself. It's such a juxtaposition between the reality of the cops and then the absurdity of the movie. But what was also absurd to me is that while there was a theme of defiance against authority, especially a supreme authority throughout the whole film, in subtle ways they counter that theme by, like, the cops, for example, there's a whole swarm of people there with shields and spears and clubs, and they were just running across a field screaming, and then all of a sudden a few nits in a police car pop out and shut down the whole thing, Yeah. And it goes, they're making fun of, like, divine authority, but at the same time, at least in that scene, they're saying this authority the state wields is even more powerful than that.
Right.
Yeah, Pat, when I lived in London, what was that? Probably 11, 12 years ago now. My memory was that unless you were Metro PD, the police officers didn't carry firearms. Is that accurate?
They only carry firearms if certain officers are assigned up firearms at airports, and they have to call out special squads. Otherwise, they're all basically, the police here are all unarmed. They have a truncheon, and I think
a truncheon, sure.
I don't even think they have tasers. So,
but this is not uncommon for the European states to have police that don't carry a gun. I mean, especially in Eastern Europe, what police chases you with is a pen and paper. It's tell me your name, and they chase you down the street. So
really?
Yeah, they.
That's what they do.
Yeah. And
I've got my biro.
The militarization of police is very much present in the States, but is in the United States, but it's not so widespread in Europe.
Do people take the cops in Europe less seriously because they're not so violent and militarized?
Oh, absolutely.
Because I know the cops over here are taken extraordinarily seriously.
Well, yes, they have guns, and they have proven that they're not afraid to use them.
Yeah, some of that scene is this sort of, I guess, this quiet capitulation that, there's this sort of very stiff upper lips English approach. Oh, the police are here, we should behave ourselves, and it's a very I liked your take on it, Justin. That was really interesting, because that is the kind of way I've in my life seen the way people have dealt with the police. It's always this sort of pleasant conversation that's, oh yes, and there's a little bit of a joke and a chortle with each other, and it's sort of, even myself have done it, over the years, and it's just one of those things. I don't experience the police. Whilst obviously they are still the strong arm of the law, as it were, I don't experience them quite in the way that perhaps people do in the US, But
yeah, I mean, I know for me, I would rather that experience of the enforcers than the one I have over here in the States. I mean, even if I am not the target, if I see the lights go on in my rearview mirror, if I see a cop nearby, I feel like the bullet has already been fired and it's heading in my direction, and I'm like, oh shit, which way do I run? Even though it may not be going your way.
No matter how clear your conscience is, at least in my experience, every encounter with a police officer in the United States is a near-death experience for me.
Yeah.
I perceive it as such. I can't help it.
I've had good and bad ones. It depends on where I was at the time. Around the Midwest, like say when I was just driving out here to to Denver. I'm in Denver now, by the way. I'm not in Chicago right now. But on my way through Nebraska, I was pulled over, and the officer he didn't even ask me, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" He just said, "Yeah, you in that other car, you were zooming right along there. Could I have your license and registration, please? I'm just going to write you a warning." And that was it.
Yeah, I never had
but then
that.
they had bad experiences too. Yeah.
I never had a bad experience with a cop. However, every time I'm in their presence, I'm very much aware of what could happen and how the situation could turn from 1 second to another.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. Kind of like you get that letter in the mail from Walmart or Starbucks, like, oh, there's probably a gift card inside, and you get one from the IRS. It's like, coronary.
Oh no! It's like it's been laced with strychnine.
Yeah.
The IRS still has that effect on us in Britain, of course. So yeah,
I don't doubt that. Yeah. Yeah, and speaking like authority in the movie, the one thing that made me chuckle the whole time is how Arthur just kind of parades around with no horse, but he's got a dude there to help him keep up the illusion. So there's this supposed man authority figure, that's on the will of God, that's doing the will of God to form the round table and whatnot, and he's taking himself seriously, but none of the peasants take him seriously, and the only people that take him seriously at all are the other folks in relative authority that want to join the round table, for example. Even finally, when God came down and spoke to them, God's like, no, stop bowing. And then everyone's like, oh, sorry, Lord. And they're like, no, stop apologizing.
Yeah.
I don't know why you people always bow and apologize. Just stand up straight, look me in the eye.
Yeah. Oh, don't grumble. One thing I can't stand is people grumbling. Every time I try to talk to someone, it's sorry this and forgive me that, and I'm not worthy. Pat,
exactly.
you should do these quotes because my accent does not fit the scene.
I don't think I can pull them off quite so well. But I mean, I must admit that whole scene. I know I've just talked about it earlier, but it just reminds me of a headmaster, and it's it just reminds me of private school. When I went to boarding school, and just this whole prefects and schoolmasters and school assembly and church ceremony, church on Sundays and stuff like that. It's all these kind of, the priest or the teacher or the headmaster, always like, always spoke in this deep, gruff voice that, stand at attention, boy, and all that kind of stuff. And it was like, you'd suddenly jump up. And of course, there's these funny quips where Graham Chapman, I think, at one point where they're talking with the enchanter, Tim, and he sort of, he goes off on a tangent at some point. Tim does, and Graham Chapman looks back to I think it's Michael Palin and says, "Well, that was a bit. What did he say? It was that was a bit of a strange thing. Strange conversation he just had when he'd already been doing this strange stuff like throwing fire everywhere already, And it just reminded me of like being in school when, you listen to a headmaster or you listen to somebody in authority speak, and you'd like go, oh, "These a bit nuts," to your friends behind you, sort of thing. And I find that fascinating because it's sort of, I guess they're the same generation as Pink Floyd, and Pink Floyd sung a lot about school life, and not just the obvious songs, which was the obvious song being "Brick in the Wall," but even like "Comfortably Numb" and all that sort of stuff. They sung most of those great songs are about their experiences in school, and I think they kind of they reflect much of that experience in school. Monty Python do that all the time. They've done that all the time, even up in The Life of Brian. But in particular, their TV series, if you've ever seen any of their TV series, there's this constant reference to the way that they talk down to people in certain scenarios. It's very much the school pupil or the teacher pupil relationship, if that makes sense. But maybe that's a very British thing, I don't know, and maybe that's not the sort of thing that because that kind of teaching doesn't exist anymore. I mean, as far as I know, it doesn't exist. I mean, but it did in my day, and maybe that's kind of, I'm showing my my age here, Generation X. But yeah, it's a kind of yeah, it's very, very palpable to me, you know.
I never had a headmaster. The only headmaster I ever had was a Transformers toy on my shelf many years ago. That's what it was called, the headmaster.
I don't know, do they call him principal
Well,
for you?
I did have a headmaster, but not once do I remember him telling me not to grumble and not to apologize. Actually, that kind of a behavior was expected and demanded of the pupils.
Yeah, I know, but it was sort of you know, it was stand to attention, boy, or look me in the eye, or something like that, or, you know, that sort of thing, shoulders back, all that kind of crap. That's the kind of stuff I remember. It was very much like being at private school was very much like being in the army.
Oh yeah.
And at least it was in British public schools. I think Stephen Molyneux will attest to this because he went to a private school in Britain as well, and it's very much that kind of militarized kind of experience, and and I think it's completely different to what most people experience in schools, particularly these days, or at least for the last 20 years. But I think it's very, very much for those guys where they probably grew up, came through schooling through the 50s and 60s, I guess, and it would have been at its that kind of militarized kind of private school would have been at its in its heyday at the time.
Well, today's schools have metal detectors, so they're not quite kind of militarized. They're actually war zones.
Well, sure. I mean, you're talking about American schools, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
And the ones that are war zones are so super shielded from reality. Like a kid can't even make the forefinger and the thumb movement with like a gun. They can't.
Right.
Yes.
They don't tolerate anything anymore.
I can't imagine that now. I mean, I thought it was bad enough in my day, and I was glad. I'm glad that it's kind of those private schools. I mean, my old private school no longer exists, and but there are private schools that do exist, but they've all changed.
Yeah,
so
there's even talk. I mean, it's extreme talk, and it's a very small minority of like doing away with like playgrounds or recess and replacing it with something else because it's just too dangerous or fosters, I don't know, some monstrous thing in society later on.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
We cannot let these kids be creative and run free.
Yeah, it's
ridiculous.
ridiculous.
Sit in the classroom and learn about the government.
Well, this is the thing about this is what I like about Monty Python when they do that, right? Because they parody that history of schooling in such a wonderful way, in such a deliberately poking real good big fun at it, because it was, these people were pompous, these teachers and headmasters were pompous and idiotic for the most part, and they never got anything achieved by it other than just blind obedience, of course, to fear. And so I really, really like the way Monty Python, as I like the way Pink Floyd, pokes fun at that school history, you know. And I think, you know, to some degree, it's the schooling, at least in the UK, and I'm not saying it's brilliant. I still don't find public school particularly my thing, and I know it's none of you guys' thing. But I'm glad that they got rid of that militarized, idiotic, pedantic, pomposity from it. And I think, you know, people like Monty Python and Pink Floyd helped to that, you know, to some degree.
Yeah.
Right.
So going back to what Justin said before about the coconuts, he's got two coconuts and he's banging them together. What really stood out for me was the fact that, okay, he didn't have a horse,
but everyone pretended he had a horse.
But he owned a person. So this, together with many other scenes in the movie, seems to portray the poor quality of life and the lack of meaning that the life of the poor or of the masses used to have back then. Because a horse, it's expensive, but you can get a guy to bang 2 coconuts for you together and pretend that you're driving a horse. So people are cheaper than horses. Not
and
to
how
mention
the peasants
people,
even perceived like people like Arthur, like in positions of authority, especially like supreme or divine authority, how they kind of have their silly quests and they go around like it's this big important thing, whereas the peasants, so-called, they're in reality boots on the ground, literally hands in the dirt, and
they
Arthur's
dig in
running
the
around.
dirt for dirt. So dirt,
Yeah.
dirt is actually precious to them. This is how low they've gotten, And
there's this other
disparity-
guy with dudes with coconuts banging them together, running around the countryside on a silly quest.
Yeah, and if you remember, I don't know which one of the knights was. He's a coconut banger. He gets shot by an arrow, and he doesn't die, but he abandons him there. It's like, whatever.
I think that was
care about
Lancelot,
you.
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't quite remember which one was it. So the lack of meaning of life, of human life, and how the low classes were treated back in the day. I think it's actually something that the Monty Python wanted to portray, because this was back in the 70s. There were so many legendary movies about the glorious past and the virtuous pursuits of the kings and the queens and the knights and the nobility.
Die for your king.
Die for your king.
And in fact, it was what was it? The plague, the dirt, the disease, the poverty, and the complete disregard for human rights.
Are you still there, Jeff? Are you?
Oh yeah. I just said the word excrement because 80 was throwing out words.
Okay.
He was completing my series of
the program
examples.
looked like he was talking and I couldn't hear anything. I'm like, what's happening?
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the things I brought up with 80 and Patrick last night, again with the disregard for human life, is 3 times throughout the movie you see people just go ahead and try to process and move past somebody's death when they haven't even died yet and they appear to be getting better.
That's what, and the most clear one of that was Lancelot, because that's the scene Addie was just talking about, where Lancelot's coconut banger gets ripped in the chest with an arrow, and he goes right down, and he looks like he's going to die, and he's laying there unconscious for like a few seconds. He starts to come to again, and Lancelot's so bent on saving what he thinks is this damsel in distress in the tower. He's got to have this quest. He's got to go do this. And, you're my coconut banger, you sacrificed. And the coconut banger's like, no, I think I'm all right now. And Lancelot's not hearing him at all. He's not paying attention to reality.
Yeah.
And then Lancelot barges through this peaceful ceremony and starts killing random people all to get to this one person who it turns out it doesn't really need as much help as he thought.
Well, I thought that was kind of interesting. It turns out it's a guy, right? And it's like, oh, that's strange. And he completely backs off, So he assumes it's going to be a damsel in distress.
Yeah, because Lancelot's a portrayal of a typical ideological extremist asshole who is all about, all my virtue, all my goals, all my for the people, all this, it's all really ever about them. And when their end result doesn't quite turn out, then they're disappointed, or they backtrack, or you're not really important to them anymore. They just don't exist in reality. And Lancelot's actions in that moment are exemplary of how a lot of, I think, people perceive other people in positions of authority. Their actions just are in congruence with the boots on the ground reality.
Right.
Yeah,
and everyone else around them is just disposable.
Yeah, I think the portrayal is of the ruler that has no respect for human life, and we see this portrayal of waste and total decadence in the scene at Camelot, where these these knights are just wasting food, are just dancing on tables, breaking stuff and destroying everything while partying. And there's a constant theme throughout the movie between the destruction that these rulers leave behind and the poverty and extreme dirt and disease in which the masses are living.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. I thought, and I also thought it was funny how when after that musical number at Camelot, Arthur says to his group, like, no, let's not go there. That's a waste of time. Now
Whoops.
this quest for a mythical relic, now that's worth our effort. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, with the scene where after Lancelot rampages through the wedding party and finds that was he a prince or just a son of a lord there?
I think he was just a son of a lord.
Okay, yeah. When he finds the heir up there in the tower, and then the Lord comes up and reams out Lancelot for all the destruction that he's been wreaking. Well, as soon as Lancelot says, "Yeah, I'm from Camelot," then the Lord thinks, "Oh, Camelot, like, okay, well, come meet my daughter, because I can expand my sphere of influence if you two marry."
Well, that's pretty much international relationships between states. You have this king who is king of a swamp. His country is very poor, and he's looking to other countries to hook up, with richer men. So it doesn't matter what one does and how many people he kills, as long as he benefits and he gets to hook up with somebody that is wealthy. He will sacrifice honor, virtue, and the lives of his men for that.
And there's another very funny reference about he's got a Yorkshire accent, which is a county, or I guess they're like states in the US, but they're like smaller places, smaller regions, I guess. There's a bit of a reference to Yorkshiremen being selfish and stuff like that, which is a kind of another sort of stereotype, I guess. So yeah, they give him a Yorkshire accent, which I thought was quite funny. So, but again, you have to be kind of English to get that reference, I think. But.
See, it's a good thing we have our British philosopher here with us.
I was just thinking
for
that.
reference.
Yeah.
It's healthy, I think, to have the perspective of somebody who's been in the culture and can reflect upon it that way, because I have never been over to England.
No, well, I mean, I find it really fascinating that people throughout the world find this really funny, and yet there's so many cultural references in Monty Python. They've never really. I know that some of those kind of are international. They're the kind of posh accents that they have, and the way that they, because I guess they've seen politicians speak like that, and I don't know, So there is that kind of, there is an international side to it, but a lot of the humour, I gotta think, has got to be lost on a large part of the international community who haven't spent any time in England, perhaps,
Well, I don't know. The themes of the movie are quite universal. I mean, we have the power of the state or the king. We have the power of religion with its mind-erasing toxicity. We have the superstition and, of course, the women and men interaction, which I wanted to address in this podcast. Most of the themes of the movie are universal, although I think are delivered with an aftertaste of British culture. They, however, address problems that are present all over the world.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about the harem of women in the
Can I add something just quickly before Amy goes on? You were talking about Lancelot earlier, right? Being kind of this arsehole or whatever. But in a strange sort of way, he saved Sir Galahad the Chaste from, toxic burning of female vagina, of course, But which I thought was kind of funny, because it's just a recent thing I'd been processing recently about saving your male friends from the toxic toxic females,
Absolutely, that is exactly what the scene is trying to put forward. I mean, think about it. The name of the castle is Castle Anthrax.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the name is chosen to be very scary and to represent, I think, the toxicity of the vile women inside of it. So this is probably one of my favorite scenes, and Monty Python is touching here on the subject of the false advertising that many women use when they want to attract clueless, but virtuous men. So Castle Anthrax has a beacon in the shape of the Holy Grail. Now, their beacon looks like the most desirable and godly object on earth, but it turns out to be fake. This is how many women choose to attract their mate, by giving out signals, of fake virtue, while at the same time hiding their true, shallow, and immoral nature, and of course clouding the man's judgment with sex. So their sexual innuendos and manipulation is clear, and the women totally mess with the mind of Sir Galahad the Chaste. They leave him confused, and the guy is completely powerless. So this scene shows how the most virtuous of men is completely unable to resist the temptation of women with low morals. But what's most interesting in this scene is the fact that Sir Galahad's only salvation lies with his friends, who come and rescue him. As in real life, men need the help of their close friends to escape the charms of predatory women. So in the Holy Grail, Sir Galahad's virtue is saved not by his sword or by his bravery, but by his buddies that come and get him out of there.
Who don't use their swords, by the way, but he was happy to use his sword, like another part in the movie.
Right. There was an irony, wasn't there? Like, because when you said what he did later on, which was to hack a hole winning past his deck.
Yeah.
And then he did this virtuous act. But I think that's passable in the film, in the artistic sense. But it reminded me very much about that sort of about the sirens in Greece or something.
Yes.
Like that. And there's a captain on a ship, or there's some aristocratic guy. I can't remember who the Greek mythology was. He said, "Tie."
I think that was Ulysses, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah, that's right. And he asked to be tied to a mast so he could listen to the sirens singing. And he was, they all had their ears plugged, and of course, as they went past the sirens, and he was demanding to be taken off this pole, And they just kept, because of course they couldn't hear him, of course, because they had their ears waxed and stuff. So it was very, very sort of similar situation. He thanked them afterwards for thank you for not untying me. But of course, it was certain death for him to jump into the sea and stuff like that. But yeah, really interesting scene. I think that in many ways.
I read that the Holy Grail came out at a time when feminism was just starting to kind of get a grip on society and influence it. So I wonder if that scene was at all relevant to that period of time, really, in feminism stuff that was going on then. I don't know, because I wasn't around then. But
I think it was around second wave, but it may have been just before second wave feminism. But I know Monty Python has been accused of being sexist. That has been.
Who hasn't? Who hasn't been accused of being sexist?
Even way back, though, it was accused of it. Even when I was in my teenage years, I remember some people accusing it of sexism.
There is that whole exchange between Zoot. It's either Zoot or Zoot's masquerading as her
evil twin sister.
As her evil twin, right? Yeah, they're having that exchange, and then she breaks the fourth wall and addresses the audience and says, "I quite rather like this scene. I think it's better than some of the earlier scenes that we've had." And she's the only one in the movie who rambles like that, and then forces all of the other characters to jump in and say, "Get on with it."
Yeah. Did you guys have any more thoughts about that, or what Adi was discussing?
Not about that particular aspect of the film, though I do have a general observation that at least is true for me and the people that I've known in my life, that the film seems to be in memory more humorous and comical than it is in actuality when I was watching it. At least for me. I don't know if it was the age difference, but when I see people watch it, and when I've been present, this is like the third time I've seen it, but I don't recall people really finding it that funny. But when they talk about it afterwards, then it's just one of those movies that kind of brings people together, and they love to talk about it. But when you're going to sit down and watch it, to me it seemed less humorous than I remember it being, but it's more funny when you talk about it with other people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had that same experience. I mean, there were a few moments which still made me laugh out loud, but a lot of it seemed a little bit dated to me.
Right. Yeah.
It did seem that.
It seems less that's less of an issue when you're talking about it with other people. Like the datedness of it and all that stuff. I mean, yeah, it's dated, but like when you're talking about like the coconuts, and I found myself chuckling at scenes as you guys were describing them that I didn't chuckle at when I was watching the movie. No,
I agree. There's this shared. I think there's a shared experience, isn't there? And I think maybe we watched this film alone, all of us. I don't know, but if we'd perhaps watched it with other people, it might have inspired more hilarity in the moment, sort of thing. Because I think a lot of it is about shared experience, isn't it? Comedy is a lot about, sharing the comedy with other people,
Absolutely. The Holy Grail is definitely a movie that you should watch with other people, and I've had the experience of watching it alone as well as with my friends. Now, what happened is I come from childhood spent in the Eastern European bloc, so we didn't have the Western culture for the longest time, and I had no idea of the existence of this movie until late in my 20s. My husband actually introduced me to it, so I loved it the first time I watched it, but then I got to introduce it to some of my old friends back home, and I got to watch it with them in their company, and I think once I watched it by myself, and there's a clear, huge difference between watching this movie by yourself or watching this movie with someone that has never seen it before. I always recommend the second experience. Is definitely a lot more gratifying.
Right.
Well, that's why I share so many movies with you and with you, AD, and with Patrick.
Yeah, I just wished you could be present in my living room so we can relax, get a cup of tea, and just watch a movie together. Because that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, my original idea for the movie club was to have a London group that would hang out and we'd be watching them together. That never really came to any fruition, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I think there is a shared experience, particularly with comedy, more than. I think there's a shared experience of all movies, etc. when you're together watching it. I mean, I watched Interstellar with a couple of good close friends, and we talked about that for ages afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, there's a kind of I think there's always extra stuff when you're kind of watching it with other people,
Yeah, I think most movies are better in company, but mostly comedies, they require the company of somebody to be fully enjoyed.
But I don't want to necessarily entirely discount the idea that some of this is dated, but that's not the fault of the movie, of course. At the time, it was completely groundbreaking in many ways, and Monty Python really were. And just because I don't necessarily find all of it hilarious in the moment, necessarily by myself or whatever, I don't think is necessarily a criticism of the movie at all, because I think it's at the time it was barking mad and it was great, and it fit the time and the period, and I think it still has a lot to say, as we've said, as we've already mentioned, but But yeah, I mean, it's just we, as humans, we evolve. We constantly want new stuff, and even Monty Python. Sometimes we think, oh, it could be more now, But yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to disagree with that because Monty Python and most of his works at least once a year or once every 2 years. They happen to cross my mind, and I pull the movie out and I watch it again, either in company or with other people. So their movies, for me, they will last forever, and I can always enjoy them.
Oh, I think there will be always a lasting. It's funny because you say that, because I was watching a Shakespeare production called Comedy of Errors, and there's some really hilarious moments in that, and that's a comedy of centuries ago, of course, and yeah, there's still great comedy in that as well. I'm really quite almost as comedic as and as slapstick as Monty Python, but obviously in a different way. But yeah.
Does Monty Python still have is it still well entrenched in cultural memory over in Europe? Like, it's especially in Britain?
Yeah, I think so. At least in my generation, it's very much entrenched. But I think even in the millennial generation as well, I think people are conscious of it, and I mean, maybe Blackadder is a bit more well known, perhaps, amongst the younger generation, because there hasn't been a lot of because of course Blackadder, was it Rowan Atkinson? He went on to do Mr. Bean, and he's done a few other stuff which is more later, of course. So he's become perhaps more well known. But no, I think Monty Python is always something that people will go back to. I think Life of Brian is very popular amongst people.
I'll have to watch that one as well, because I've never seen that one.
You've never seen the Life of Brian? You have.
Shame on me, I know. No, I have not.
He's not a messiah. He's a naughty boy. Oh, well, that's just the funniest line, but yeah. Sorry, Jeff, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say I'll out myself too. I haven't seen Life of Brian. I've seen
the club, my friend.
Yeah, I've seen Meaning of Life, but not Life of Brian.
Well, as most of Monty Python's movies, The Life of Brian follows a series of logical fallacies, non sequiturs, and it's pretty much the same humor that.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But speaking of logical fallacies, I know that Jeff wanted to talk about the perversion of the Socratic method that is depicted in the movie, and more precisely in the witch burning scene.
Yeah, during the witch scene, it was just something I thought was amusing. It was how you saw Bedivere try to use the Socratic method to awaken people's innate reasoning and ability to conduct themselves logically. But actually, he ended up. I mean, in the movie, the test worked, but he ended up guiding them to something that was completely ridiculous. Was trying to see if a woman weighed the same as a duck in order to see whether or not she was a witch. And also, he dismisses the two correct answers that the peasants first give him. What else floats in wood? Bread, apples. Like, well, yes, they do. So why are you unhappy that they shouted out those answers?
Yeah, well, I think what he does there is he uses the Socratic method and the methodology of it for sophistic purposes. So he's one of the biggest sophists that ever walked upon this earth, and he's hiding his sophistry under the guise of reason. That's what it was most intriguing to me in that scene, because he goes, he follows the methodology of the Socratic method completely, but what he does, he only looks for correlation, not for causation, not for any other connection between the subject and the thought exploration. So he ends up with this completely absurd conclusion after a completely absurd argument based on a true and reasonable methodology.
Right.
That is only Monty Python can successfully achieve that kind of dialogue.
Right. twisting
I feel
something that
tense for
should
not
be
having
useful.
caught that when I watched it.
Yeah, they twist around something useful and that should be useful and should be encouraged in just about any institution of learning to achieve exactly the opposite.
They use reason for evil.
Use reason for evil, exactly.
Do you think that was the intent of the writers, or do they? I mean, do you wonder if they were seeing it that way as they were writing it, or do they just were like kind of chuckling at the absurdity of the conversation? I mean, I'm kind of going for the former option because they were very intelligent writers. But.
I am
Sure.
absolutely certain that they knew they were pretty. Their expertise was pretty high on the Socratic method because. The way they portray the rape of the Socratic method is too accurate for them not to understand the methodology.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, just to have a character who does nothing but ask questions in order to lead people to conclusions. I don't think you can write a character like that without knowing what that is. That's
Right.
Without knowing that that's the Socratic method.
Yeah, interesting.
Makes sense to me.
So, was there anything else? Because we've been talking now for around an hour and 10, but we could probably, if there's anything particularly people really wanted to tease out of it, I don't have much more to say on it. But
Well, Justin, I know you wanted to talk about the swallow scene and connected with analytic philosophy. And how it focuses on the clarity of thought and precision of language, and that scene being juxtaposed with the rest of the movie, which is quite insane. I think
know,
it's
isn't
important.
that weird?
Yes.
That's what initially drew me in when I first saw the Holy Grail, and I watched it again. I was like, "Oh, this is a super intelligent movie." And it got more absurd as the film went on. But like, it took like this ridiculous, silly Arthur guy comes up and makes a pronouncement as if what he's doing matters, and the guy up on the wall is, asking for greater precision in language, and this guy who is essentially a politician paying someone to be his patsy has no idea how to respond. He's like, well, what do you mean? But later in the movie, he actually takes what he learned from that encounter and uses it to his benefit to make himself look more knowledgeable than he actually is.
right.
Asshole. But yeah, the swallow scene, I was just like, the dialogue of it was like they were asking for clarification after clarification. I mean, the guy on top of the wall was very precise in what he wanted out of the conversation, and Arthur just was not mentally capable of meeting that level of excellence.
I think it's interesting you bring up, because that just reminds me of bureaucrats, right? It's
Exactly.
Like when you go in and they say, "Oh, this you haven't signed." I mean, I remember I have a limited company, and I remember when I first had this limited company, I needed to change my address and tell the company's house, which is this institution you have to register with to have a limited company with, and I sent them, and they gave me this form, and I filled it out as much as I could, and I put my new address in, and they sent it back. Said, no, you filled it in wrong, and I was like, okay, well, I mean, so I rang them up. I said, well, how do you fill it in? Well, it's self-explanatory on the form. I said, no, it's not, because I filled it in and I filled it in correctly. Well, normally most people ask an accountant, so now you're not having to pay £50 to an accountant to get it filled out. And so it kind of reminds me of that situation. If you can't, you've got to say the right thing or whatever, or have the right explanation for something, and then you'll tick the boxes in the right places, and everything's fine, because it's not really well known to anybody,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that scene every time I watched it, the first time I watched it until today, every time I watch it, it seems to me that and I don't know much about the Monty Python crew, but it seems to me that they were in a room and they were trying to get on with the script, and write the story, and there is probably one of them who is this kind of all-knowing, intellectual or analytical mind, who kept interrupting and kept playing the part of the character in the movie that
Right.
asked questions about the swallow, and he kept interrupting them with these specific questions, and that's how it seemed like they actually experienced that while trying to write the script, and then they said, "Hell, it's too funny. Let's just go with it."
Yeah. That
And if you
actually
can
true.
disrupt bureaucratic nonsense with asking, I mean, I've seen it done in court cases. I've heard a lot of people in the activist movement, the libertarian movement and whatnot, they'll go to court. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. But even if they're not successful, they bombard the judge or whoever it is and standing before them and oppose apparent authority with these questions. And it does have a disruptive impact on the process, of oppressing somebody or the judicial process, because they'd rather you just shut up and play along, right?
And pay them.
Right?
Yeah. Actually, it's so true, because I saw an interview with Palin and Cleves.
You say Palin, do you mean Sarah Palin?
No, Michael Palin.
Oh, Michael. Okay.
They were talking. I think it was the Bishop of Durham. I can't remember who it was now. It was a really interesting conversation. But they did talk about this idea that they literally riff off each other when they're writing. They will take the situation that they're in and actually convert that to a storyline or to a script line in whatever they're writing. So if someone's farted in the middle of like a discussion or something, they might use that in part of their little skit, whatever. So I think that makes a lot of sense, AB. That may well have been a sort of situation whilst they were writing it together.
Patrick, I have a cultural question.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the movie, one of the supposed knights calls one of the other a tit. Does that happen a lot over there?
I'm all ears.
A tit is an idiot, basically.
I got that, but just the way he came out, he's like, "You dumb tit." I'm like, is that language still used, or has it evolved out of the lexicon?
It's difficult to know, because I don't really.
Has anyone ever called you a tit?
Yeah, they have called me a tit, and I've called people a tit, I guess, but I haven't done it for a while, so maybe it has like moved on. But definitely, it was something you would use at school, to people, you stupid tit. Or
so it's
something.
like a juvenile thing.
Yeah, it is. Again, it keeps. This is what I love about Monty Python. They keep, in a sense, a lot of it is juvenile humour. Certainly, private school juvenile behaviour. And I know they all went to private school, and of course they went to Oxford as well, and they're in that kind of schoolboy humour in many sense. I mean, so yeah, tit is it's unusual. I mean, I guess it's. I mean, obviously people know what tits are, but but in that particular vernacular, it means idiot, of course, and I don't necessarily think it's particularly used that much. People might call people a twat now, which is, of course, female genitalia, but yeah.
So what other part of the female body is it going to evolve into a generation or so from now?
I don't know. The elbow, maybe. I don't know. But,
yeah, you wonder, where else do they have to go?
Yeah, I think they've done them all, really.
Well, they could do labia. They could be like, you labe.
Lady, babe.
If that
Farther
catches
up into
on, Justin, if that catches on, you can claim it.
Excellent, I will.
Just go farther up into the womb and then the fallopian tubes.
Yeah, you stupid tube.
Tube, yeah.
Well, tube. You guys call the subway. You call it the tube, don't you? So
We do. Yes,
that might be a confusion there.
Right.
But yeah, no, there are really silly references to as I say, cultural references to words and insults and they were kind of juvenile insults. I mean, they weren't really. I mean, tit was never considered particularly. I mean, I guess I wouldn't have used it in front of my parents. I probably would have probably been roundly admonished for it, but it was something you wouldn't have a problem with telling a friend they were a tit. You know, it wasn't like a huge insult. You know.
So if I saw someone do something dumb and
Silly.
whatever, and I was over there in England and I said, "You tit," well, would they just not
silly.
even notice that I said it?
Yeah, they just laugh with me. Probably.
Is it like saying "you dummy" or "you goddamn"?
Yeah,
idiot? Like,
I don't know what the American. I guess the American would be a dummy.
what's the matter of force? Like if I say "you dummy," that's kind of like one kind. It's a kind way of saying, "Oh, you fucked up," you know. But you're not calling the person an idiot. You're just, "Oh, you dummy." But if you say "you goddamn idiot" or "you fucking," you know, it's more force behind it. So I was kind of curious if tit was more like dummy or if tit was like.
No, it's something you would use amongst your male friends. It'll be like a word.
Okay.
You
So it's
just
male
use-
jabbing. Got it.
Yeah.
Hello. Excuse me. Is this still the Philosophy Film Club podcast, or did I end up in the wrong place?
Yes, you silly tit. Come back.
Oh.
It's freewheeling now.
Yeah.
Sorry, I waylanded us from the original discussion. I'm always curious about cultural differences like that. So.
No,
Especially if they involve tits.
Not necessarily. It struck me. I wasn't expecting it. I was shocked a little bit.
They never use the expression they always use for tits is normally knockers in Monty Python. And of course, that's a very, very English expression for breasts, you know. And they normally, if you listen to their TV series, they constantly refer to knockers, you know. So it's, but again, that's a very English phrase as well. But again, it's kind of light, you know. This is why I find it always find it strange how an international audience. There are obviously parts that internationally people don't get, but it still manages to sort of. You know, transcend that for the most part. You know, it still has a great deal of humour in it, enough for people not to be too bothered by the references, cultural references, rather.
Yeah, the witch scene actually, where they're about to haul her off, and she says, "Well, that's a fair cop." I actually had to backtrack that a couple of times to understand what she's.
Say that again?
Yeah, no, it's a fair cop. Yeah, and. I pretty much got the gist of it. That she was like, "Oh well, it worked, and they caught me." But I did actually also look up the meaning to find out literally what the translation was.
How does such a phrase even evolve? What does that even?
Well, I guess it's a fair cop is like copper, which is an old English word
cop.
for
I thought you said
cock.
You know? Cop. What?
You think you're in genitalia all the time, man. You know, mind your filthy mind, honestly. But yeah, it's to do with cop. It's like, you know, we don't even use the word copper now. I mean, I think copper was used by my grandfather, and of course Americans have shortened it to cop, of course, but we don't use that expression at all here now. But we do use ironically we do still use the expression "a fair cop." That does still, I still hear people saying that occasionally, particularly in London, you know.
Okay.
So one thing I didn't understand about that scene, in the end, she weighs as much as a duck. Now I understand that I'm asking this question about the most absurd movie of all times, but how's that possible?
Yeah, I had to watch that scene twice to see whether they put some extra weight on the duck part, but I couldn't see anything, and I just, that didn't make sense to me at all. It was like, I think it was just part of the whole absurdity, you know, of the whole thing, you know. The illogicness, you know, the analogy that he was taking them, like all those pretend.
Because it seemed to me that there was the experiment which would have proved the reasoning wrong, and the experiment actually sided with reality was transformed according to their irrational analysis. I don't know. It's there was a moment when all that whole train of thought should have been proven wrong, but then reality somehow bends and sophistry succeeds.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Happens
And of
all
course,
the time.
yeah, and of course, whether it floats or not, that's not dependent on weight. It's dependent on density. So they
Yes.
really didn't. In the end, they didn't find out anything at all.
Yeah.
I think it goes back a little bit to what you were saying earlier, Adi, about this is a quip. This is really poking fun at the institutions, and I think that again is perhaps poking fun at the institution of the courts.
Oh yeah, the justice system, the whole justice system, which is mostly based on bad judgment and edicts and superstition.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, the judges still wear the robes as priests.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Powdered
They
wigs
read
and all.
from a book who is considered holy, the Book of Law, and and it's one of the most contradictory collection of writings after the Bible.
Well, the court system is just as prone to cultural superstition as it always has been. I think. I mean, you take that with for instance, like false rape allegations, right? And the way that the courts will often will not see the injustice that's been caused from it, and will compared to the justice that they'll perform on rape, So so I think cultural ideas seep into the court system, and I think that, in a sense, that kind of exemplifies that. I think a lot, because it was barking mad. It was bonkers, right? She weighs as much. If she weighs as much, it's wood and ducks float and wood float. It's like, oh man, you really have to stretch yourself to get to that point,
Right.
Well, first they try to frame her by dressing her up. And that's when who is he? Is he a knight or the
I
guy?
think he's just like the local town authority, like a equivalent to a mayor or something like that.
So, so the authorities shed light on that. It's like, oh, what happened here? See, this is not proof. This is not proof. This is not proof. You dressed her up.
It looks to be going well at first, doesn't it?
Yes, and then they introduce, after they shed some light on the subject, they introduce their reasoning. So, and that's when everything goes down the drain. This is why I think Patrick is totally right. Is they're ridiculing the justice system there quite a bit.
Something that struck me about the opening credits was they're interrupted multiple times by these apologies. We apologize for the subtitles. Those responsible have been sacked. Well, then it doesn't stop there. They need to get rid of the people who hired the subtitlers, because they're also a couple of idiots, I guess. And then it doesn't stop there. They've got to get rid of the firm, and still the credits come out completely wacky. And this reminded me of the Who Watches the Watchmen problem of trying to make a state apparatus work. Is that, well, I mean, where do you stop? Somebody's got to keep track of what these other rulers are doing, and therefore it can't work. And I mean, the whole reason that Monty Python exists is to have a screwball comedy. So how do you think you're going to end up with something different by just firing a few pieces of this team?
Yeah, that's really weird, because I never thought about it that way. But while you were talking, the image of the state came to mind over and over and over again when you were talking about the opening credits. And I think you're totally right about that. That's another parody of how the state apparatus works.
Yeah, well, that was a great call we had. Really enjoyable call. I think both Jeff and Justin, really great guests, I think. What did you think, Adi?
Oh, I had a blast with the guys in the call. As usual, when Justin joins, the laugh is definitely gonna be there. The laughter,
Right. Yeah,
and the fun.
Yeah. I mean, my overall take, I think, from the Holy Grail was, I think I sort of mentioned this through sporadically through the call with the guys, and was really it's they really like mocking institutions, and it seems to be one of the biggest things. And I was listening to John Cleese actually today, an interview he had in Amsterdam. So I think it was last year or the year before, and he was asked about this question about being in positions of authority, and they always seem to typecast him into positions of authority, and how he likes to make them look kind of stupid, and
I would say incredibly stupid.
Yeah, incredibly stupid. Yeah, I'm probably being a bit too easy on him, but he agreed. He said that he said that I love doing that because he said this, if there was somebody, he said if there was somebody in a council house watching TV that spilt their drink, did something stupid, no one would really think anything of it. But if somebody of importance or supposed importance does it, it becomes a much more funnier thing. And I think this sort of underpins a lot about Monty Python and their way at mocking institutions. And I think they do it in a really good way and a really interesting way. And I think they did it with the monarchy. They did it with with political systems. They even did it with the police at the end. They did it with the French. I mean, they just
and let's not forget the institution of church religion. With the monks walking around, chanting and hitting their heads against what were those? Were there wooden boards or?
I don't know what that was. Banging their heads, wasn't it? That's right. I remember that.
Yes. Oh, by the way, what they're chanting is Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem, which means merciful Lord Jesus, grant them rest. Right. And I looked it up. This incantation is part of the old Latin funeral ritual.
Right.
So practically they were just killing themselves, killing their reasoning abilities, chanting funeral for their brain.
Yeah. Although I thought maybe it was related to the Black Death thing, but I think that was kind of something separate. But yeah, it was very. Yeah, I mean, this whole thing, I think they tend to sort of they do tend to really magically. I mean, I'm going to use a rude word, but just take the piss out of every institution there is.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how old it is. It doesn't matter if it's a current institution or an older institution. There's most of the material in the Holy Grail is really about mocking institutions, and I think that makes it all the more interesting for me.
Well, this is what I think gives the movie its universality, because institutions in their current form have been around for a long time. I mean, they've been transformed and a little bit changed, but they pretty much function under the same principles. So whatever was funny in 1974, it's still funny today, and it will still be funny as long as these institutions will exist.
Yeah, it is funny though. There is a slightly different period in history back then, because people held institutions back then in some form of reverence. I mean, particularly the church even. I mean, I don't want to necessarily reference another film of theirs, but Life of Brian, which caused a great deal of consternation with the church, and it actually got the film banned in several counties up and down the country. Well, in the UK at least. I don't know about elsewhere.
What a surprise. What a surprise.
No, it wasn't banned by the church per se. It was banned by councils, of course.
Of course.
Again, other institution.
Isn't that how it always works?
Yeah. But it is interesting how those institutions at the time, when they were doing that, and this is perhaps something I'm more familiar with, having grown up in that period. I mean, I was 74. I'd have been about 8 or something like that, I guess. But but there was a lot more reverence for institutions back then. And so this irreverence, as it were, that Monty Python did, was quite risque at the time.
Yeah, and I imagine it was quite shocking for people because this kind of narrative was not quite so common in culture as it is today.
No. I mean, now it's a penny a minute to take the mickey out of institutions. Nobody really thinks too much about it.
Oh yeah, the public opinion has shifted quite a lot only in the past 10 years. If you think about it, imagine how much it has shifted since 1974.
Yeah, I mean, I can think. I mean, it set the roadmap for Blackadder, Spitting Image. I mean, all these British comedies that came after Monty Python, probably in the 80s at the time, which kind of took on that Monty Python-esque sort of ritualistic sort of humiliation of institutions. So yeah, it was it did set the pace, and I think the thing I like about the way that Monty Python do it, and I think this is true even maybe of Blackadder as well, is they did it in a sort of warm and sort of it was just so hilarious and so funny that nobody could really get too offended by it, which I think it was often people who never watched it.
I don't think a lot of people got it. I think you called it warm. I think that the humor is quite pungent. It's quite sharp. Why the film hasn't caused more outrage, I think it was due to the fact that not a lot of people understood the message. It was so coded and so confusing and so absurd that you needed some pretty good reasoning abilities to be able to decipher the message that they were trying to put forward with this movie.
Yeah, I think you're right. The absurdity of it, I think, lent itself to people perhaps not entirely understanding it, like you say. Yeah. And and it was so absurd that it just had you laughing at the absurdity that you kind of forgot what it was actually talking about. I guess, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, great film, and thanks for bringing it. I didn't think comedy was going to be a thing for the film club, but I actually almost it's more of a I guess a socio-political film in many ways, more than it is, say, philosophical, although that does affect philosophy, of course. But it's an interesting, a much more different way of looking at movies, and I think that's what I like about comedy. It has a completely different take on it.
Yeah, a different approach. And speaking of comedy, I don't want to leave our listeners without answering one of the most important questions of this movie.
Mm-hmm.
What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? Because
45 meters. I don't know. Go on.
Here at the Philosophy Film Club, we answer all the tough questions. So I thought that we should put this matter to rest once and for all. So the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow is about 11 meters per second, or 24 miles an hour. The swallow beats his wings only 7 to 9 times per second, and not 43, as they say in the movie. And also, the European swallow does not weigh 5 ounces, but only 20 grams, which is less than an ounce. So now that this piece of information has been delivered, the world will be such a much better place.
Right. My only complaint would be that is there such a thing as a European swallow?
Yes, they're actually.
I thought they were talking about European and African like it was migrating. So when it was in Africa,
if I'm not mistaken, today in my research, because I researched a little bit today to find this answer, there are actually 2 types of African swallow. One that is migratory, and the other one is not.
Oh right. So one of them one of them comes to Europe and the other one just stays at home.
Yes.
I see. And is that one bigger or smaller or?
Oh, it was actually written, but there was a piece of information that I chose not to memorize because I still need some room in my brain for more important stuff.
No, fair enough. So, yeah, were there any other things you wanted to conclude with or about this film?
I just wanted to leave our listeners with a few thoughts about the movie, as I usually do. Monty Python and the Holy Grail is a movie that I think it's best seen in company, especially when one is showing the movie to a friend that hasn't seen it yet. Now, I'm talking from personal experience when I say that introducing the Holy Grail to someone new is guaranteed to squeeze a few more laughs out of you, even when you've seen the movie more than 5 times. Yeah. So, from the sarcastic depiction of British versus French rivalry, to the lessons in anarcho-syndicalism, and from the scientific analysis of the nature and abilities of a swallow, to the perversion of the Socratic method, Monty Python succeeds in delivering the most surreal movie based almost entirely on logical fallacies, non sequiturs, and sprinkled, of course, with the typical dark British humor.
Yeah.
And although it's a comedy, the Holy Grail depicts more accurately the average life conditions of the time, and this movie stands in huge contrast with many of the 70s movies that back then they used to glorify a legendary past where brave men chased their idealistic pursuits. So this is actually a more accurate depiction of those times. We spoke about culture and its institutions. The movie uses the pretext of a cultural symbol, which is King Arthur, to mock all other irrational products of culture. But this movie became a cultural icon of its own, and its universality, it made it last through the years, turning it into what it is today, a cult classic. And although the Grail is the depiction of the absurd, the fans of the Grail from 1974 until today have never found any difficulty in connecting the events in their lives to scenes in the movie. And we all know that a true Grail fan will always find the right quote for any situation and will always be eager to deliver it in a very bad British accent. Unless that fan is Patrick, and then the British accent will be absolutely perfect. And just to leave our listeners with the last thoughts, this is what I think it's a must-see movie, because if you haven't seen it yet, one day, soon, you will encounter a certain circumstance in your life when you will definitely need a quote from the Grail to either, get through some hard times or to make an entire room full of people burst out laughing. So ask any fan of this movie. Life is a lot more exciting when you are able to compare it with the scenes from the Holy Grail.
Yeah, that's so true. So very true. Okay, well, that's a good show. And anyway, for the next show, well, we haven't really decided yet, and I have a few thoughts, and we'll probably put them up on the Facebook group, and me and Adi will discuss this over the next week or so to decide. It probably won't be a comedy again, but we'll probably have a comedy at some point. Again, I quite enjoyed this one. I maybe want to do Life of Brian one day. I'm trying to tease Adi.
I'm all in.
Yeah, but good show, and thanks, Adi, for your introduction and your conclusion. And thanks to the guys also that joined us. Really appreciated it. And we'll see you again. Bye for now.